Nice to see you. I have a great pleasure to announce the lecture held by Professor Fabio Hernandez Palacio, who is an associate professor in city and regional planning at the University of Stavanger in Norway, and he is also a visiting professor in the chair of housing environment. His area of expertise is focused around understanding the nature of high-quality urban environments, mostly the urban form and its influence on societies. He has worked as a consultant for public and private entities in Colombia, Netherlands, in the areas related to planning, transportation, accessibility, urban and architectural design. Also with his students, he engages actively in the urban transformation debates in Norway through mostly workshops, collaborative projects with local authorities. He has also published numerous papers on urban morphology, density, and the impact of urban form on accessibility. And this lecture is entitled Urban Design Elements, Ideas for Students. Please, Fabio, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I really feel important here with all those cameras in front. I can tell you that, it might be a little bit scary, but I hope we can have a smooth conversation. Well, this lecture today is a little bit of a mix of personal experiences, a little bit of what I experienced as a student and the challenges to understand the complexities of cities, which in the end, I think cities are quite simple to understand. We made quite complex processes, especially nowadays, but I mean, you all live in cities, and I think pretty much you understand well, and you are able already to distinguish what cities work well, or what part of a city work well, and what others work less well. We are trying to tell why or how is that. And well, these urban design elements are about those characteristics or those qualities or those conditions of urban areas that make them to work better. Well, one of the first questions that we have is on city planning, urban design, and architecture, and when the one starts and when the other starts, how are they related or overlapped, or what is the difference between those elements? Where the one ends and the other begin? And then, I mean, we get two elements like the ones that you see on the screen. You see, for instance, in the first one, a map of centralities for the city of Copenhagen. In the second one, you see a sketch of a master plan and urban design. In the third one, you see just a group of buildings and small square and a system of public spaces. Below, you see one of the buildings here, one of the new buildings in Cracow. And it is a multifunctional block. And then you see a series of elements that are in between architecture and urban design, and is how buildings relate to public spaces. And the last drawing is how we regulate that in, in normal planning documents. So it's about setbacks, dimensions, proportions, and in a way, of course, we can say with clarity that the first drawing, let's say this one here in the large scale, is what we call 100% city planning. However, in the last one, when we have those more details, as I mentioned, those setbacks, those dimensions of buildings, sidewalks, they are also considered in city planning documents. So it means that both things, architecture and city planning, can be quite interconnected, especially if we want to create a good relationship between buildings and urban spaces. And let's say urban design is something in between. When we talk about urban design, it's mostly the work that we do, let's say, between the scales 1 to 500 and 1 to 2,000, some in between that we call urban design. City planning is more complex because it goes all the scales through. And architecture is something that we mostly do in the more detailed scales, but of course it has to do also with the larger scales. So all these three disciplines are really interconnected in many different aspects. If we want to put it simple, it is complicated. I would like to show you here some examples. How can we make these complicated things look more simple? We know very well that those guys made all those things to look simple. I mean, the Romans, they were quite good at creating very successful cities quite fast. They had quite a basic recipe to create cities. All of them looked quite the same. Of course, they were adapted to multiple contexts, but they have this quite a standard formula. They had this grid with two main streets, Cardos and Decumanus, and a wall and a series of public buildings that were very important for the well-being of the inhabitants, from temples, baths, another type of facilities for the well-functioning of the state. Here we have one of those typical things. They were not exactly square always. Of course, they were adapted to the local topography and the local conditions, but those elements were present in most of the cases. And if we see in the drawing to the, oh, it's not passing. Yep, yeah, it's there. Here we can see that, I mean, it's not exactly that square thing. It is adapted to different contexts here to the topography, but all the elements are there. So if you see here in the image, you have a series of things. For instance, if you consider the main square, that main square, of course, had commerce. It was, at the same time, a space for commerce. It was a marketplace. But it was also the place when you put a main temple, and also you locate the most important buildings for the distribution of justice, power, etc. And the rest were quite simple buildings. They only dedicate very much detail and beauty and effort to the very important buildings. The temples, the public buildings, but as you see here, housing and the rest, I mean, they were quite simple buildings. But of course, I mean, also infrastructure. They were they were simple in a way, but they were made for lasting. I mean, we still can see pieces of Roman cities in many places around, and they have been there standing for 2,000 years or more. And if there is something that we can say is sustainable, are those things. They have been there for centuries, for millennia, and they are still standing there, and probably with very poor maintenance in most of the cases. And the most interesting, they look nice, and probably you have heard of a famous Roman architect, or at least when I was studying architecture, one of the first books that we had to read was the 10 Books of Architecture by a Roman architect called Marco Vitruvio Polio. And they had this combination of three concepts that for them were very important. Utilitas, which means utility. Firmitas, which means solidity or sturdiness. And Venustas, which means beauty. And for them, all buildings, they have to combine all those three elements. So they need to be useful, they need to be strong and solid, they need to be beautiful. Well, those other guys here, the Spaniards, when they went to the Americas, I think they also made quite good cities there, many interesting cities, and they have even probably a more simple formula for making cities. They have this basic, they call it the laws of Indies, and they have this very simple grid, in many ways similar to the Roman cities. And basically that they did is that they distributed and separated very clearly the public from the private. And they allocated to different people and institutions some plots in this grid. And of course, they located the very important buildings in the center around the square, the main square. And some facilities, let's say, of course, at that time, the state was mostly concerned about military power. Whatever hospitals, education, that was matter of the church. So they gave many of those plots very well located to different orders in the church, and they created convents, hospitals, schools, and so on. And of course, it was, of course, some detail and some care for beauty to the church, but for the rest, it was quite minimalistic. And as you can see here, this is a Spanish city in my home region. It's called Santa Fe de Antioquia in Colombia. And as you see, it's a very simple city with this very simple structure, and it still looks quite nice. And it's a heritage site there in Colombia, and it's very popular with tourists and local people as well. And I would say the same here in Cracow. I mean, those people in the Middle Ages, they have very simple formulas as well to do very nice cities. And indeed, Cracow is an impressive city. And the formula was quite similar to the previous formulas. They located the very important buildings in the main square, but the squares were mostly an empty space for multiple activities, both for markets, for ceremonies, religious or civil ceremonies. And of course, in this main square was the church and was the main public building. And for the rest, they have, of course, some regulations for buildings, and all of them, they were grouped in blocks. So putting those blocks, buildings together in blocks, that was a characteristic of those historic cities that you have seen in all of the three examples before. Well, here we have a new development in Cracow. They are planning to have a city or a part of a city in Cracow for 100,000 inhabitants. And then I wonder myself, will the inhabitants call this area beautiful? And, or will this part of the city be of interest, let's say, for the people who visit Cracow? Will it become an area, let's say, to declare UNESCO World Heritage? And, well, I guess that many of you probably will answer with skepticism to those questions. And, well, we know that we are quite bad today at making things that are beautiful, that are solid enough. And, well, let's say for the Romans, even the aqueducts were beautiful, were interesting to see. But let's say here, I mean, the Germans, they are trying to make nice aqueducts, make aqueducts cool again. Pink is nice, I would say, but yeah, probably 10 points for the Germans. This is one of those aqueducts in Berlin. Well, they are not exactly aqueducts. They are just temporary things to pump water out of the ground to make underground parking or constructions. But anyway, they look quite bad. So I came to this question actually through a podcast. It's a philosopher that probably you can find easily in YouTube. It's called Alain de Botton, and he has a YouTube channel called The School of Life. It's about many things. But it's also, I mean, he has a few things about the built environment and why city matters. And he had this question: why are we apparently unable to make better cities despite having better technology and doing many things better today than in the past? And apparently we are not able to do cities today better than we did in the past. Have you ever wondered about that? Well, it is complicated, again, it is complicated. And not because cities itself are necessarily complicated, as the examples I gave you earlier, they are indeed quite simple in a way. But, I mean, at some point, we started to dislike the old cities and the old ways of doing cities, for many reasons. When, here I have a map of Paris in 1830-something. I cannot read properly, but it's before the famous Haussmann plan. And the first thing that didn't or start working in cities is that we have cities with walls to protect from in wars and things like that. And because of advances in technology, basically in artillery, those walls became to be problematic or not necessary and so on. So they were removed, as they were removed here in Cracow. So that was kind of one of the first things to be problematic in all cities. So they were not good enough to be protected against threat of war. But of course they were in many ways, they had aesthetic problems. Many buildings probably were derelict, at least that was the case in Paris in the middle 19th century. They also have problems with functionality. It was difficult, let's say, to provide transport, appropriate transport in a complicated, intricate network with a lot of narrow alleys. And I mean, people started to realize with the advance of science that greenery, access to natural light, etc., was important for public health. So health became to be very important with the advance of science. We start to discover that many diseases were due to poor sanitation conditions, lack of air quality, lack of access to sunlight, hygiene. We need to have better infrastructure, sewage, water, etc., and security. In Paris, at least in Paris, that is the case we are looking here, there was quite a lot of riots and protests that were quite strong as the one that we see there. So they were quite violent, not only the French Revolution, which is the most famous that you know, they cut the head of the king, but later on they have many other revolutions that were very chaotic and very problematic. So local authorities decided to make a big plan, because at that time they thought that changing cities in a way can also change societies. And the plan was quite ambitious, because as you remember the previous map, I mean, Paris was kind of dense and very intricate with this medieval compact core. And what they decide is to make a series of new streets, new avenues, cutting this medieval tissue, this medieval fabric. In this way, they just go directly, straight lines, cutting through the medieval fabric, and that's the results that they had. So this plan, which is known as the Haussmann plan, lasts for 20 years. Haussmann was the mayor of Paris during that period between 1850 and 1870. And he did the very famous Paris that we know today, that we find very attractive. It's one of the cities more visited by tourists. And this way of dealing with cities kind of became fashionable. And many cities started to do kind of similar things elsewhere. But also in the late 19th century, we have a lot of new technological developments. And those new technologies also created new possibilities. The one, of course, was the introduction of the steam machine, the railroad. The first metro line, or the metropolitan train, was established in London and around 1850s. Paris and many other cities followed quite quick. And the first cars started to appear. And also we had a lot of developments in new materials that were quite radical for the time. It was the case of steel and glass. I mean, imagine that in the Middle Ages, except for the cathedrals, most buildings, we were obliged to have very solid walls, small windows. We were unable to do those big glasses, so all was quite dark. And suddenly it was possible to have very light structures with a lot of glass. It was quite a revolution. And later in the United States, of course, it was also possible to do very high buildings very quick, high-rise skyscrapers. So it was a huge revolution. And then we have the car. Initially, the car, of course, was to replace the car pulled by horses. And it was more a curiosity, something for the weekends. But very quick, it was developed an industrial production of cars, and cars became very cheap, and many people started to buy them. And they were very problematic in cities. I mean, basically, traditional cities didn't have space, as they don't have today, for running a transport based on cars. So then architects start to look how to deal with new solutions or new ideas about cities that can accommodate all those things that we have. Okay, we have problems with hygiene. Cities are very compact. We don't have enough greenery. We don't have enough space for cars, and so on and so forth. And then one of the, there were two very popular models, or well-known models. The one that you see in the screen was the Broad-Acre City in the United States by Frank Lloyd Wright. All of them were around 1920s. And basically, of course, in the US, it's a huge country with a lot of land. And the type of city they envisioned at that time, Frank Lloyd Wright envisioned, was a city basically merging rural lifestyle with urban lifestyle. So with new vehicles, and it was quite a visionary. Those are not exactly drones, but looks like drones in 1920s, but mostly because of new flying devices. Of course, the aviation was starting, but also cars. So he thought that it was possible basically to live everywhere what you like in the vast territory of the United States. So it was basically cities where everybody will have an acre of land, and facilities and production will be concentrated in some areas, and people will move around with these new technologies, meaning mostly cars. In Europe, of course, we had quite a different situation. Cities were more compact. People and land was not abundant as in the United States. So Le Corbusier, that probably you all know from, a very famous Swiss-French architect. He came with an idea of making, of course, cities compact, not as Wright that really wanted to have low-density cities, but basically for Le Corbusier, the idea was to concentrate cities by functions. For him, cities were kind of machines for efficiency. The problem of traditional cities were that they were, according to him, very inefficient because they were mixing everything. They were mixing, we have those traditional blocks, mixing businesses in the first floors, housing in the upper floors. They were noisy, and everywhere it was a mess. But thanks to cars, it will be possible to divide and separate those functions. And basically, he came to the idea, as you see in this diagram, that it was possible to separate, let's say, in the upper part of the image, you see offices with administrative buildings. In the medium, you see houses. Then in the lower part, you see factories. And of course, in between, a lot of green areas where people will have possibilities to make sport, enjoy the nature, and people will travel in between those areas using cars, of course, and modern transport. All of those visions, they had something against traditional blocks. As you know, all those old cities that we saw, they had these traditional blocks that you see there in the right. And then, for Le Corbusier, the way of dealing with blocks were to concentrate them in large super blocks with a lot of high-rise housing. And let's say in the United States, kind of the application of Wright's principle, they were of course not possible to have that much space, but they came to this diagram that they call the Radborn layout. And probably you recognize this type of pattern in many cities today. It's still going on. And it was a layout that was developed almost 100 years ago. And is very common in all suburban areas today. And of course, the Le Corbusier approach was also very much applied, especially after 1950s in the post-war cities in Europe. The other problem, of course, is that we develop, modern planning is much more complicated than in the past. So we develop very complicated systems to develop urban areas. We have our planning system, it goes to different levels, centralized, local governments, ministries, a lot of laws in different levels. Just to ask for a permission to build a house, we need to go through long processes that can take months. Many people, you are asked to ask your neighbors if they approve or not. So many people have a say in how we build cities today. And then, of course, when you start dealing with a project, let's say all of you are working with urban areas. I mean, it's not just the nice design that you are doing there, which is, of course, important, but you need to ask many people around. You have to involve many people. For instance, this is a case here. If you get participatory planning, this is all the groups of people that you need to deal with. Local schools, organizations, inhabitants, etc. It takes months. And in addition of that, the city became a money-making machine. So we have developers, people looking opportunities for business to sell offices, to sell houses, and they want to make that money quick, to make it kind of cheap, to make a profit of that. And then, I mean, we end up making the process of developing good cities quite complicated. But I mean, I don't want to scare you of that process. I mean, I think you are here studying architecture because you want to do something good for society. So I bring this image here. Is the Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. It's a famous painter by Caspar David Friedrich from the German Romanticism. And I think it's a hope that we can do things better. And indeed, there are ways of doing cities better. So I will call that back to the virtues of traditional cities. There are a few things that we need to learn from traditional cities. I mean, traditional cities, they have been there for hundreds of years and they work well. As different from the previous models that we saw, they have quite high densities. For instance, this is a city in India, but I mean, the same things are to be found in many places, in many cities around the world. All of them, when it comes to open and build space, they are around 50-50. So it is build space is around 50%, and open space is around 50%, but this open space, public is 40% around, and private open space is around 10%. Of course, those percentages vary from place to place, but this is something to keep in mind. Probably you have noticed when you move around, if you have a lot of open space, a lot of green areas, those areas tend to be less interesting, less used by people, especially at night, especially women, they tend to feel unsafe going through those areas. So the key of good public spaces is actually to have them in small proportions. So we don't need vast and enormous open public spaces, but we need them well distributed. And that's the key of traditional cities. And here is quite a broad list of what make good places. And of course, there are formal aspects. Of course, there are social aspects. There is about activities. But that we need to consider is cities and structures that can be adapted to different needs. One of the problems that we commit very often, let's say when we design public spaces, is that we think them for one or two activities and that's it. But successful public spaces need to be adapted to many different functions, to many different users. So they need to be flexible because, of course, we need to accommodate all of those needs that appear in this graphic. The other very important element when you start thinking of your design is the type of network. So we have evolved networks in this way. You see from the left, the very compact networks of traditional cities. Then around 1950s, we started to introduce more kind of curvilinear loops, patterns, and we ended up in those conventional cul-de-sacs or lollipops that are very inconvenient. I mean, if you live in an area like those cul-de-sacs, most likely you will need a car to go everywhere. So you don't have possibilities to, let's say, if you want to have a nice coffee, you need to have a car, then you need to find a parking place to go to the center of the city, and you are very limited by the possibilities of transportation. If you are a young person, you live with your family, so basically you are depending on your parents to move you around. Or if you are an old person and you have problems for driving, basically you cannot live there because you will be closed in your house forever until you die. And of course, this is the Radborn layout. And imagine, I mean, we have here in theory, some public spaces that are those green areas in between. But as you imagine, those are the back yards, they are the back of the houses. And if you feel there, just imagine walking there at night or just let your children play there. I mean, nobody will have an eye on them. You don't know if a psychopath will come from one of those houses and will do something crazy. So it's not control over the public space. And basically, all is car dependent. So in a way, this type of design that we have implementing in all the new developments around everywhere is quite a bad idea. This is one image that we urban designers love. This is the map of Rome. We call the Noli map because it was made by an Italian. He was more like he was not really an architect or a planner. He was more a person who drew plans or maps, and he is a topographer, and he did this map of Rome like 400 years ago. His name is Francesco Noli, and we know this as the Noli map of Rome. Of course, it was a huge map. This is just a fragment. But what is very interesting about this map is that it shows Rome with all the public buildings and the public and the street network and squares in white, and all the private buildings in black. And it is such a complex network of possibilities that make Rome so interesting. And if you, let's say, if you compare this layout with a Google Maps today, you will notice that in 400 years it has changed very little. Especially this structure of public spaces is quite the same. So the same square, the same streets, very, very little change. So it means that in cities, the most important thing, the things that last the most, is the system of public spaces. If we develop solid networks, if they are well interconnected, if spaces are dosified in small quantities but well distributed, we will have cities that are very attractive and will serve many generations of inhabitants. Today we have technologies, or we have developed scientific methods to understand networks, urban networks quite well, and we know that works. We have a lot of tools like graph theory, space syntax. Probably you haven't heard of those techniques, but those are computer-based techniques to understand urban networks. The one in colors is the typical space syntax map, and you see in red the areas that are better connected, and in blue the ones that are not that well connected or not central. And one of the critiques when you say, let's say, many people think, let's say, of the center of Cracow, is that it is very noisy there. It is very uncomfortable to live there because it's just noisy everywhere. But that's not true. I mean, I have been living there the last 2 or 3 days, and it's very close to the main street, but because of I am in one of those less well-connected cities, and back to a courtyard, it is very quiet. So you create all this diversity of spaces for different needs, very attractive spaces for tourists or for just hanging around, enjoying a coffee, watching people, or more quieter place for studying or just for having a quiet night as well. So if we develop those complex networks, we will have a tremendous diversity of spaces that are good for everybody's needs. And that's the thing that we forget when we oversimplified city planning in the models, as you saw previously, those modernistic models. The possibilities of having a good street network is that they are very flexible. Here I have an example from Barcelona. Probably you have here, or you will visit, or you have here of the super blocks. As you know, Barcelona was of those plans developed in late 19th century, and they developed a very well-connected grid with broad streets. And of course, until 10, 15 years ago, all of those streets were just for cars and just narrow, well, not that narrow, but if you compare with the space of cars and the space for people, of course, the space for cars were like 80%, and the space for people in the sidewalks probably that were the 20%. But what they started to do now is those super blocks. So they start to close group of blocks and develop those very interesting shared spaces. So those are the spaces where they share the surfaces with different mechanisms. They share the space for pedestrians, cars, but cars, they really need to go very slow because they are supposed to be areas where the cars and people can coexist. And of course, they introduce a lot of greenery. There are a lot of concepts, of course, to make cities more climate proof. Probably you will hear or you will at some point study about nature-based solutions for, of course, plants and vegetations, and they are good in many ways for making cities cooler in summer, but also if there is rain, to capture rain and avoid floodings. So all those things are being combined today in streets. This is another example of Medellin, Colombia. That's my home city. And in the center, of course, they have done many things, some of them horrible. But in the 1980s, they built a metro line, which is a viaduct. It was originally quite ugly, quite an ugly piece of infrastructure, but now they have been introducing a lot of vegetation and taking out a lot of space for cars. And basically, I mean, they are making the city center very attractive just by introducing and improving public spaces and creating those public spaces interconnected and introducing greenery. And here is a graphic representing how we see today cities as a multifunctional spaces, not only for circulation, for cars, but also for greenery, for people to use as public spaces, for people to share. And of course, the other key thing in building high quality urban areas is back to the traditional block. Here I have some examples. I mean, what is beautiful about the traditional blocks is that they are very flexible. They are very multifunctional. You think of each of those buildings and they can be reused in many different ways. So this is the truly sustainable urban form, because you don't need to demolish everything. You just can refurbish each of those buildings one by one according to different needs. They can accommodate multiple functions. They can have commercial facilities in the ground floor. They can have quiet areas in the green courtyards in the center of the block. And they can have quite sophisticated penthouses in the top, terraces, many functions there. So a block can be a small city in itself with a lot of diversity. So it is this concept that I like a lot by David Sims. He called layering. So really designing every layer of the city as a separate, well-integrated element. So the underground, of course, can be used for parking or for storage. The ground floor for public activities, for commercial activities. So then you can have apartments in between and quite special functions in the top, green terraces, etc. And you can create a lot of diversity in those blocks. So back to the basics. I will go back to this very simple layout of a city. So what these people did well, they created a very clear street, a very clear street network. They did a very clear separation between public and private. So those are all ingredients for a good urban design. So clearly separate what is public and what is private. They added some key functions, different places, some schools, hospitals, public facilities. Eventually, they created some of those streets with different characteristics, some more broad or with a different treatment. They added, in some cases, some greenery, some fountains, or some interesting things in the public space, but not necessarily. In many cases, those were just hard squares of stone to have different events. They add buildings in blocks, and blocks, as you have seen, they have many possibilities. So in that way, with very simple elements, it is possible to create high, diverse cities with a lot of possibilities for everybody. So I have here, I came to a very interesting example. I know that some of you are working in an area in the periphery of Cracow with a lot of challenges because of infrastructure and so on. And I have an interesting example in a way applying those principles in today's case. And it's this area in the center of Copenhagen. It is Jernbanebyen, so it is railway city. And it's by a consultancy company called Kobe. There's a large consultancy company, and they also do architecture and urban design, but construction, many things. So remember the elements. So first, think of your grid. So connect the area that you are dealing with whatever is around, with nature or with facilities, and create a solid network. Think of that network, of course, in terms of functionality, but consider that that functionality may change with time. Remember, for instance, the example of Barcelona. Those streets, they were initially designed for, in the 19th century, before cars. They were designed for horses and for other things, but they have been changed in many ways. So those networks, they need to be very flexible and support many functions that we don't know, but we need to make them robust enough to support change. Consider greenery and open space as networks, not just as separate things, but systems that work combined together. Take care of important characteristics of the area that you find there to create identity. In this case, was greenery there or some old buildings, old facilities. Consider the streets, not only for traffic, but also for space for greenery, for nature-based solutions, for spaces for people. So they are a fundamental part of the network of public spaces. In this case, of course, they create a series of local districts with different identity. And they created a series of events or special elements in all the project that create interest for people just moving around. It's about different environments, different functions, facilities, etc. And think of blocks, because blocks can be very diverse. They can accommodate many different functions, and they create proximity between functions. They create diversity of spaces, from spaces that are very kind of people-oriented with traffic, with when you want to enjoy just watching people, but also quieted places with for needs for everybody. And they can be accommodated in many different ways, so they create a lot of diversity. As you can see here, they think really in the city of layers. For instance, the idea of combining buildings with public spaces like this is not exactly, it's a building, another building in Copenhagen that they create a sport field over a big shopping mall, like the one in the corner. And that's how the project looks like in an urban plan. And I would like to end my presentation with this quote by attribute to Socrates: by far the greatest and most admirable form of wisdom is that needed to plan and beautify cities and human communities. So just think of cities as the most important thing for people thriving and for good societies. Thank you for your attention.